Welcome to Ethicality, a podcast about ethics, compassion, trust, and accountability, and their critical but often overlooked impact on business and humanity. We're your hosts. I'm Nadia Khalili.
And I'm Dan Gorman, and we're really excited today to have Mercina Tillemann from the Global Blockchain Business Council. She's definitely one of the thought leaders in the field of blockchain and supply chain in general, and we're really excited to talk with you today with kind of this ethical focus on the technology and also just how blockchain is kind of positioned across with like AI and IoT and how it kind of sits in the framework of technology today. But I think to get started, maybe if you're just able to give like a brief background on yourself and like how you got into blockchain in the first place, what interest or intrigued you about it in the beginning of your journey?
Of course, thank you so much for having me. And I have been with the Global Blockchain Business Council for about 4.5 years, which in most industries doesn't sound like anything at all. And in blockchain, you're like one of the dinosaurs, so it's kind of cool. But I came from a background really in strategic planning and consulting, most recently in the pharmaceutical sphere, working on more equitable paradigms for global pharmaceutical pricing. And when I heard about blockchain in 2016, initially, I definitely associated the idea with, selling children and buying drugs. And it took me quite some time to understand the broader implications of potentially opening the global marketplace to populations who have historically been excluded. And that was the promise that got me to reevaluate what I was doing with my career at the time and to embrace a very different direction. Obviously, the last 4.5 years have been full of a lot of very significant changes for the industry, and it's been a privilege to have a front row seat to all of that action. But I think some of these ethical questions have yet to be resolved, and it is an important responsibility on anybody in the space to continue to bring them up because they're not always top of mind for stakeholders and decision makers in the space.
That's really interesting to hear. And I think part of where we wanted to start or move forward in just this discussion in general is like, how do we define certain things? Like, I think a lot of times, at least for me, when I'm reading articles or hearing speakers, and it's kind of just implied that something means something, like what does ethical supply chain mean? But I don't often see these types of things defined anywhere. And we all might have different ideas of what it is in our head, which could be part of the problem. So I was just kind of curious, maybe like your thoughts on how you would define ethical supply chain, and then maybe we can dive into like ways blockchain fits in the equation.
It's a great question, and I don't promise to have a perfect definition on that, but I will say it's a great topic of conversation, taxonomy, in the space, because you can't really purport to be solving the same problems if you're all using different terms and definitions. And when you have a completely new vocabulary, those things really ought to be established. So it's actually one of the projects that GBBC is embarking on this year with one of our initiatives is identifying shared taxonomy. And we have some really great partners on that initiative. But in terms of supply chains specifically, I think the lens through which I tend to view it is kind of transparent supply chains. Because right now, most of the supply chains upon which we rely are tremendously opaque. We have no idea who's participating, where they start, what happens from start to finish. And it really leaves you in a challenging position to evaluate the products which you're using or the services which you're paying for. And so when we think about ethical supply chains and blockchain, I usually think of it through the lens of transparency.
From everything that I gathered, during my school project, it seemed to be that that was one of the most promising aspects of it, especially from the consumer standpoint, was the transparency. And then we understand that the incoming generation, like Generation Z of consumers, are highly mistrustful, not just of corporations, but their governments, and they demand transparency. And it is a way to build customer loyalty. And more we're seeing people really invested in responsible sourcing, for example. And this is a tool for companies to establish trust and sort of boost their own customer engagement and boost that brand loyalty. But also it's very empowering from a consumer perspective as well. I'm curious how you get businesses on board to be more transparent. Obviously, things like implementing blockchain can heighten and improve operational efficiency, but isn't necessarily conflicting with, you know, their existing partnerships, and or is it a very huge undertaking for them to kind of redevelop their whole infrastructure?
That's a really good big question. And from my perspective, without trust, you have very little room to operate. And in a recent Edelman review called the Trust Barometer, they found that globally, 85% of citizens don't trust their institutions to work for them. And that's a pretty mind-boggling statistic. A lot of work needs to be done in order to repair that deficit of trust. And even if in the short term it may seem expensive for institutions, whether we're talking about governments or Fortune 500s, to go through the process of, you know, shedding some sunlight on their processes, whatever they might be, in the long run, I think it's going to be absolutely critical if they're going to be able to hope to function in the kind of hegemonic ways that they have been. And so you are seeing some of these very large corporates take steps to totally revamp their processes. I think, especially when you talk about blockchain, Walmart is always pulled up as a really great example of examining their supply chains. And it all goes back to this story with an executive who went into a Walmart store and pulled some mango off the shelf and said, "Where did this come from? How did it get here?" And it took a team of 30 people over 6 days to track every step of the supply chain. And when you're thinking about food safety issues, that isn't really a reasonable time frame to be dealing with. In another life, I did pandemic planning and public health for the city of Houston, and the process of identifying where bad foodstuffs came from was really sensitive and serious, and you need to move very quickly. And so Walmart did embark on a process of revamping some of their supply chains, implementing blockchain-backed systems. And after doing that, the same process that took, 30 people over 6 days took about 2.2 seconds, which is a dramatic improvement. And ultimately, they're going to be wasting not just less human capital, but also less product. If they can effectively identify exactly what went bad, they'll only be pulling those food products from the shelves and not wasting other things. But going back to trust, if you don't have a high level of trust with consumers, it doesn't matter how good your internal processes are. I'm not going to trust that you pulled the right foodstuffs off the shelves, and I'm not going to be buying mangoes anyway. So I think it's really important to keep communication open, and not just to do the work behind the scenes, but to be a little bit more open and communicative with your consumers about these processes to allow them to build trust in the systems, whether it's the technology or whatever new platforms you're adopting.
Yeah, that's like a really great description. And I can't help but think, especially when I hear kind of a business case laid out like that, it just seems like blockchain can fix all our problems. And like, what else would we need? Like, would we just throw blockchain at everything and it will do the trick? I was kind of curious, like your thoughts on misconceptions around blockchain, or like in order to fully get the maximum benefit of blockchain, we also need to think about how it interacts with like other technologies or policies. Like it's not just blockchain itself, but I feel like sometimes the way it's positioned, it's kind of like, why is everyone not just using this technology? It solves all our kind of responsibility problems.
Yeah, I think it's been challenging for the industry because from the outset, blockchain has been inextricably entwined with cryptocurrencies. And not to say anything negative about crypto or digital assets, because I feel like tremendous value is being unlocked by those new applications, but it is a little bit of a limiting lens through which to evaluate the technology. And it also, we've seen different seasons where individuals have been taken advantage of potentially, or maybe just not educated and been able to, lose a significant number of assets in the space. And all of that can cast kind of a negative light on the industry. And I think it's been quite distracting, really, because most of the value that we're going to see from the space, I think, is going to be in ways that are much less obvious, that are really behind the scenes. You're going to appreciate, knowing exactly where the wool that your sweater was made from came from, but you won't necessarily know that it was blockchain that facilitated that. And I think that's hopefully the direction in which we're moving, and we'll really feel like we've accomplished something as an industry when we're not talking about blockchain anymore. We're just talking about the incredible things that we take for granted that kind of make up the fabric of everyday society, but that are markedly better than what we used to take for granted as being, good enough.
That's extremely helpful. I loved your point about how we typically kind of automatically go to cryptocurrency when we think of blockchain, and that is a really limiting application of just the potential that blockchain has. And when you try to search blockchain, and it's poised to revolutionize so many different industries. Is there an industry that, and this might be a hard question to answer because it's probably rare, but is there an industry that is often overlooked? I'm like COVID-19, for example, blockchain has played a tremendous role and can continue to play a tremendous role, but are there other industries that are not overhyped, that there is a fundamental need for heightened traceability and transparency, and more efficient systems?
We've spoken a lot already about supply chains, which I think are kind of top of mind when we think about all of those. I was looking back at some notes and realized that one of my last trips before everything locked down was to California to meet with the aerospace and defense industries, and to identify all of the ways that they need to track and trace the parts that go into making airplanes and spaceships and things. And I thought that was really exciting because they do deal with counterfeiting, and we also deal with it in all of the electronics that we use. All of those deal with a lot of sensitive materials, and making sure those have come from ethical supply chains, but also that they are what they say they are. But beyond supply chain, my next two industries that I'm probably most bullish about, not including financial services, where I acknowledge tremendous things are happening and it's really exciting. But I would say government services and the medical industry.
Awesome. And kind of tying this back into some relevance today of like the COVID pandemic and just your experience with pandemic response in a past life, like if you had to kind of work to put together a roadmap now for the future of how to maybe prevent as big a negative impact for like a future pandemic or something on that type of scale, where blockchain could be like part of the puzzle, but maybe it also involves like business and policy, other technologies. Like what at this point, kind of on the spot, like what do you think is maybe the right mix, or at least areas that should be evaluated more to ensure that like when something else bad happens, that it doesn't have as big or as long a lasting negative impact?
It's a good, other very big question. But I would say just to acknowledge something which maybe isn't addressed as openly as I think ought to be. A lot of really brilliant professionals have created plans for these worst case scenarios. And every major city and the minor ones too have pandemic response plans, which are very thoughtful, very thorough. And, you know, if they had been followed and had been resourced effectively, I think we would be in a dramatically different place. That being said, there are so many new opportunities facilitated by these emerging technologies, which could make responses even more effective and agile. One of the challenges that we've seen over the last year is this siloing of critical data. And so hopefully, your public health system has a mechanism for accounting for all of this critical information, but how do you share that securely with other entities who need access to it? And then how do you connect that to both public and private entities in an anonymized way in order to capitalize on resources that would like to be accessible and helpful to address these various challenges? Over the last year, there were so many actors from the private sector who were very keen to dedicate their resources to addressing the challenges of the pandemic. And there seemed to be a real disconnect because information was so siloed. There wasn't anyone who was pulling it together effectively. And if there were better systems for communicating all of this information in a really safe, secure way, well, of course, protecting the identities of anyone who might be attached to the data, I think we'd be in a better place, and hopefully that's something we can work toward. You also think of things like digital identity and digital payments, which might have facilitated other aspects of the response if they had been implemented at the government level. E-governance is very new everywhere in the world, but you do have really exciting examples to look to, like Estonia, where all of their medical records are digitized on a blockchain-backed platform. They have e-voting, they have digital ID. So it's not as though it's impossible. Of course, they have a population that's just a little over 1 million people, so very different to implement something like that in Estonia than it is to implement something like that here in the United States. But I think, we have tremendous intellectual resources, assets from the public and private sector. Like, we have the manpower and the technology to do it. It just takes making it a priority. And I'm very bullish about this next administration doing that. We'll see. There's a lot to tackle, but I'm optimistic.
You touched on such a great point about just even digital identity, for example. And normally, as much as I'd like to be a futurist, I am very skeptical of new and emerging technologies, but it's really hard to find any sort of ethical dilemmas when it comes to blockchain because it seems to address just that. And we live in an age of information, and most of this data is being hoarded, and blockchain is a way to kind of transform that and allow or enable people to have more control over their digital identity, as well as share information collaboratively on a global level. And so that, I think that's what truly makes it unique and makes me a blockchain fanatic. But secondly, it still is relatively new. And I think there's so much promise that it offers, and it seems to be very interdisciplinary because when I first started, researching blockchain, it all was like tech jargon. And even though it's relatively simple, I don't really know how the average MBA graduate, for example, or anyone looking for a job fits into this equation. Like, do you need to have an engineering background? But then as you peel back the layers, no, there's a political aspect to it. There's policy, there's governance. It's just, and then there's also a community aspect. And a lot of individual empowerment. So for someone who's looking to get into the realm or just, immerse themselves into the industry of blockchain, what would you recommend?
It's a great time to get involved in the industry. There is so much activity, and almost every company that we are working with is hiring right now. So I would say good choice because there's probably room for you in the space, and we really need an abundance of backgrounds. It's not just developers, though those are always extremely sought after and few and far between. But we also need, as you mentioned, like policy minds, marketing minds, legal minds. There are so many things to be created, and we have a legal and regulatory group which is really building up legal thought in this space because it's all new and we really need that. The regulatory space is so fascinating all over the world. You have different governments setting up sandboxes to test this different technology and to see how it interacts with existing regulations. And then you have others who are creating entirely new paradigms without testing it out. And so it's really an exciting moment to get involved. And I would give the advice that really do your research before getting involved, because it is an industry that takes a lot of time to feel well grounded in. Before I accepted my job, I think I read every book that had been published on the industry, which was admittedly not that many, but it was helpful to feel grounded in some way. And it's interesting because we work with so many different types of companies, and it's clear pretty quickly in conversations the ones who have been in the industry for a long time and really understand the technology in a nuanced way, and those who were drawn because it was kind of flashy and interesting and maybe aren't applying the technology in the most thoughtful or useful way, or maybe they're using blockchain in place of a technology that might be a better fit. We are obviously advocates of blockchain, but really we're advocates of the thoughtful application of the technology, because it doesn't serve anyone if you're not actually capturing new capability or efficiencies. And so often, whether it's with governments or different companies, if they're considering adopting the technology, we have questions we go through to determine whether blockchain is really the right fit for them, or whether maybe another technology might be. More often than not, it's a combination of technologies. And that's where you unlock the real value, is when you're able to marry these different solutions. But it's a really exciting time to be in the industry, and there are definitely a lot of new roles. So I would say do your research, and there have never been more job postings on LinkedIn.
Good to know. Good to know.
Yeah, that was an awesome response. I think a lot of students will be really interested in that. But I know we're coming up a bit on time, so I think maybe our final question or two. One, definitely want to allow some time just for you to give an overview on like the global standards mapping initiative that GBBC put together, kind of showcase that work a little bit, and then maybe an interesting one to close with of if there's any questions that you wish you had been asked about blockchain by now, but you have not, and why.
Okay, well, let's start with GSMI because that's a little bit easier. The Global Standards Mapping Initiative is a project which we announced about a year ago, and our main partners were MIT and the World Economic Forum, and we call it GSMI for short, so that's how I'll refer to it, but it was really an effort to catalog existing standards in the space, which can sound kind of snoozy, I acknowledge, but is actually critical for an emerging industry. And when we talk to governments, they really have a great appetite to engage in comparative analysis to understand what everyone else is doing, but it takes a lot of time to get to a point where you have that information. And we had kind of assumed that somebody else was doing it. And it took us a while to recognize that no one else had embarked on that effort. And so we did. And ultimately, we cataloged standards from the legal and regulatory side in over 185 jurisdictions. We also looked at over 30 technical standard setting bodies and identified nearly 400 industry groups which touch the blockchain space, which was probably the most baffling statistic that I encountered during the project. But what we found is there is still a tremendous amount of fragmentation. There's an increased need for collaboration. And when you're dealing with a borderless technology like blockchain, it makes a lot of sense to coordinate efforts because it's very naive to consider that an issue that's being dealt with in one jurisdiction isn't going to need to be addressed in another one. So that project culminated in a couple of reports and an interactive map where you can click on a jurisdiction and then see the guidance and the regulations that have been passed or introduced there. And that was released in October of 2020. And then this year, we are going to release version 2.0. We have a number of different partners. We have 9 working groups this year. So we're going into things like digital identity, like taxonomy, like derivatives, like the green economy. So it's going to be a much more expansive look at what has been standardized currently and what a pragmatic path forward might look like. So I don't always think of standards as the most thrilling thing, but if you want a mature industry, they're critical. And we're very excited by the cohort that we've been able to bring together to work on this project. In terms of questions that I have not been asked about in this conversation, I guess one of the things that I always like to talk about is like the work that our members are doing, because they are really exceptional. We have over 250 institutional members, and I was just interviewing the CEO of the Inter-American Development Bank Lab, which is one of our partners and one of our observing members. And especially over the last year, it's been remarkable to see how they have recognized needs highlighted by the pandemic and used blockchain to address them in really cool, creative ways. They are using it for property rights. They're using it for pandemic passports in different parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. Also using it to help distribute aid, and seeing the agility and the ingenuity of groups like that is so exciting to me. There are a number of just really brilliant individuals and groups working on these challenges right now with the technology, and it makes me excited about the future and hopeful that we will actually, get to a better place, and we have tools to move in a positive direction.
I think that's so cool, especially because you're talking about everything that they're learning even just from this recent pandemic, and it makes it seem just all the more dynamic that there's always stuff to learn and take away. So it seems that your team is really extracting new insights and actually shaping kind of the future of blockchain in a really unique and collaborative way.
Yeah, well, it's such a cool position to be, at the intersection of all of this public and private sector activity, and we're excited about what's coming and grateful for all of the energy that's being put into solving these problems.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mercina. I really appreciate your time and all your insights and willingness to share all of this through this podcast.
Of course, my pleasure. And let us know if we can be helpful in any way. And good luck. I'm excited to hear the episode and then future episodes. Well done.